we're talking about Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, or more specifically, non-Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. And in the last video, we touched on the weird stuff that Moses probably wouldn't have written about himself, things like how humble he was, or things like how he died. That's strange, and we can sort of put those examples into their own separate category. The weird, the silly, the stuff that you might bring up at a party around the punch bowl when you're just wanting to strike up some rousing theological conversation and you say, "Would you like some punch?" And also, isn't it strange that if Moses wrote the Pentateuch, he would have had to included his own death story? You can see how I might struggle in scenarios where I have to interact with humans, so just maybe don't do that, okay? We've also talked about the language issues, namely the Pentateuch is written in a form of Hebrew that Moses would not have known or had access to. And we've talked about the presence of editorial remarks that go well beyond the time of Moses, things that betray a much later context. There's also stories in the Pentateuch that repeat themselves, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. They're called doublets, and there's actually quite a lot of them. One example that you're probably familiar with is this literary motif of husband and wife traveling in a foreign territory. Husband knows that wife is super hot, so husband thinks that all of the foreigners will want to take the wife and murder him, and in order to sort of skirt around that, husband asks wife to tell all of the foreigners that she is his sister, so that he won't be murdered, but that she might still be taken into a harem. This is not a great story, especially coming off the heels of Abram being called by God to this great work. We'll talk about that more next week. But this story, it happens, and just like the husband, the insecure husband, thinks will happen, it does happen. The foreigners see how amazingly beautiful Sarai is, and they want her for their king, so they ask her about the relationship here. She says that she is the sister of Abram. She's taken into a harem, and Abram gets a bunch of stuff. This happens not once, but twice to this couple, and then it happens again to their kid, Isaac, and his wife, Rebecca. Now, what most people would say is that happening that many times is a bit unlikely. So maybe there's this literary motif, this tradition up here that the different authors are grabbing onto and then applying to satisfy a literary need that they might have. That's probably a weird way of phrasing that, but they're using this well-known motif, this structure that happens, and they're applying it in these different passages. It's in this case, it's actually a triplet because it happens 3 different times, which is strange. There's also examples of doublets, of retellings of these stories that contradict with one another. The stories of Abram and Sarai talking about how she's the sister, like that doesn't contradict, it's just strange, and it would be weird for the same author to be writing this multiple times. But there are other stories, doublets, that when side by side you compare them and you say, man, that doesn't go together, and it would be unlikely for these 2 stories to be written by the same person because they don't agree with each other. This week we're talking about the primeval history, and since one of the most notable examples of this comes from the primeval history, actually 2 of the most notable examples come from the primeval history, I thought that we would just hang out here and talk about the creation story, or better, the creation stories. Because what we have on a good close reading of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 through 3, we have 2 separate creation accounts that seem to be written by different authors that don't really go together. In fact, they contradict each other. So in Genesis 1, and if you want to be technical, this is actually Genesis 1:1 through 2-4a, and then the following creation story would be 2-4b through the end of chapter 3. But if we're, just for ease of communication, let's just call this first one Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, we have a certain depiction of God in the creative process. First of all, this God is identified as Elohim in the Hebrew. In the English, God. God is the one who is creating, and this story is very structured, it's very ordered, it's very repetitive. We have the days that sort of act as a framework for all of the creative acts that take place within this chapter. Day 1, day 2, day 3, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day, the second day. Like, we've got all of this very deliberate literary structuring that's happening here. You can even go back to the second verse where it says that the earth was formless and void. These terms here, tohu vavohu in Hebrew, formless, tohu. It's depicting a kind of a mass of stuff that needs to be shaped. It's chaotic, it's all over the place. And what happens in the first 3 days, God forms the formless. God makes this world habitable. And so what we have here in the first 3 days is God forming the world according to tohu, fixing the tohu, and then in days 4, 5, and 6, God is filling this void, the bohu. So this is a very structured, literary, maybe even poetic retelling of creation that depicts God in such a way that God is overseeing all of these things, speaking things into existence, for lack of a better term. I say that because this depiction here is not creation ex nihilo. God is not creating out of nothing. God has stuff, water, mass. God is moving and shaping the things that are already in existence. The point of Genesis 1 is not to tell you where those things came from. Okay? And then in Genesis 1, the climax of creation is, I guess you could say it's two things. The climax of the creative process is the creation of humanity. They are invested in with the image of God. They're created in the likeness of God. And they're created to do certain things. They're created to reign and rule over earth in place of God, as God is sort of hovering up here. God is transcendent, and humanity is invested with these almost kingly duties. And then in day 7, there's the institution of Sabbath rest, kingly rest. We've got this story in Genesis 1. Genesis 2 is very, 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 very different. And it starts with the depiction of God. First of all, God is named differently. God is not Elohim. God is Yahweh Elohim. In English, that will be Lord, in all caps, God. Now, it's different because if you're just talking about the same main character and you're one author, why would you switch titles halfway through? It's strange. It's not something you can't overcome, but it's strange. And also, the depiction of God theologically is very different. God here is not just speaking things into being or moving and shaping. God is getting God's hands dirty. God is playing with the dirt and forming someone out of the clay and breathing the breath of life into that being's nostrils. And then God is entrusting them with tasks, and God is then creating a woman out of this first creation. God is taking the rib and creating woman out of that. Like, God is very much involved and invested. Remember in chapter 3, this is the same author and the same story where God is walking around with humanity in the cool of the day. Very different depictions of God in these two stories here. Also, we have a different order of creation in Genesis 2. This one's going to hurt, okay? Just sit tight. In Genesis 1, the climax of creation is humanity. Before humanity is created, animals are created. The very last thing in Genesis 1 is humanity. In Genesis 2, the order is different. In Genesis 2, the creative order is man, Adam, and I'm pausing there because there's different ways that people think about this, but for lack of a better term and for lack of more instruction, let's just go with that. God creates Adam. And then God says, it's not good for Adam to be alone. And then in the Hebrew of Genesis 2, it says, so God created the animals to see if Adam might find a suitable partner amongst the animals. Very different. What a lot of English Bibles do with this, you'll see this in the NIV, it turns this order into something that harmonizes with Genesis 1. So in Genesis 1, humanity is the last thing created, and this poses a problem for Genesis 2. So after God creates Adam, it says it's not good for Adam to be alone. Now, in the past, is how it's translated, God had already created the animals, and God brings the animals out from the things that God has already created to see if they might be a suitable partner for Adam. But they are not, then God creates woman. But in the Hebrew, the easiest reading of that is God creates Adam, and then because God wants Adam to have a partner, he creates animals. That doesn't work, then God creates woman. So there's a different ordering there, and it's contrasting. You can see this in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. They translate it in the way that I'm proposing here. That's a much easier reading of the Hebrew. The NIV's reading is not impossible. It's just, you're really reaching, and it's very clear that the only reason why they would translate in that way is to make Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 say the same thing. Okay, so we have all this stuff from a close reading of the text, the content that Moses probably didn't write about himself, the issues with the Hebrew language, the editorial notes that betray a time that's much later than Moses, the retelling of stories multiple times, and then as we've seen in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the retelling of stories that don't fit together, that sort of contradict one another. And in light of all of this, scholars began to say a couple things. They began to say, one, no way did Moses write the Pentateuch. In fact, one 17th century philosopher, really, named Baruch Spinoza, he famously concluded, it's clearer than the sun at noonday that Moses did not write the Pentateuch. Which left scholars with a problem. Well, who did write it? Which leads into the second big claim they started making, which is the Pentateuch is made up of different sources. And this explains why we've got 3 stories of the husband and the hot wife motif, and we've got 2 stories of creation, and we've got other things that seem to be repeating, and we've got things that show up that are late, and we've got all this different stuff. People began to say maybe the Pentateuch is made up of different sources that are brought together to give us what we have now, and that is what we'll talk about next.